Hello everyone, my name is Chanakya Bagya Ramesh, and today I'm going to be presenting the findings of a study that we have conducted at University of Miami titled Titanium Dioxide and Silica Dioxide Formation in AC Coronal Discharge Assisted Combustion. Now, as we are moving towards greener sources of energy, we also want to make nanomaterial production more sustainable. And from this graphic, we can see that combustion is one of the best methods to generate nanomaterials, which are used in a wide range of applications, which can be from sensors to fuel cells and to lithium-ion batteries. Now, as combustion is one of the best methods to generate nanomaterials, making this process more sustainable translates to making combustion more sustainable. And one of the ways that has been one of the proposed solutions is introducing plasmas into combustion. Now, by doing so, it has been found that a flame can be made more stable, efficient, and we can reduce its emissions. Now, this has been attributed largely to the high concentration of charge carriers and radicals that are being introduced into the flame by the plasmas. And as this process is strongly coupled, as this process of particle formation and growth is strongly coupled with a charge environment, such high concentration of charge carriers could provide better control for us over this process. Now, particle formation in flames has been studied over the last few decades extensively, and from all these studies, it has been found that this process happens over several stages, where the first clusters are formed by the mechanism of nucleation, where they come together, and then they further grow by a mechanism of coagulation and condensation. Now, as the flame itself is an active region of chemical reaction happening, there is a large concentration of charge carriers and radicals that are present, which is why a flame in itself is considered to be a weak plasma. Now, to obtain better control over this process, and due to the presence of charge carriers, there have been attempts to manipulate the movement of the charge carriers by applying electric fields. What this does is this introduces something called an ionic wind, and depending on the direction and how you introduce this ionic wind into the flame, you can have different effects. Though this technique has provided better control over particle formation and growth than in traditional flames, it is still limited by the fact that there's only a limited amount of charge carriers that are present in there. Now, when we introduce plasmas into the flame, the main advantage that we have is that we increase the concentration of charge carriers by several orders of magnitude, and by doing so, we could produce particles which are drastically different and with better control than the ones that we generate in traditional flame. For this study, our main objective is to introduce coronal discharge into a flame system and to see how the coronal discharge influences the size distribution of titanium and silica dioxide particles. For this, we have a flame which is premixed stoichiometric methane flame, and we sustain it in a stainless steel tube burner. And the particles that we generate from here, we sample it by using a hole in a tube type dilution sampling probe, and we then send it to a high resolution DMA which is coupled with an electrometer. Now, the main advantage of the high resolution DMA that we have is that it lets us look at particles from the sub-nanometer size to a size of 10 nanometer. So really bridging the gap between the gaseous phase to the particulate phase. To introduce coronal discharge into this system, we used two high purity tungsten rods as electrodes, and we connected this to a high frequency and high voltage AC power source. Now, this is important because there have been previous studies which looked at similar influences from coronal discharge, but they employed a DC power source. Because they were using a DC power source, they were generating ionic wind, and this ionic wind was the main reason for most of the changes that were observed in such system. But because we are using AC power source, we are eliminating the ionic wind factor, and the effects that we see here are mainly due to the presence of charge carriers. Now, we operate the plasma under two conditions, P1 and P2. P1 is for a plasma with a power of 56 watts, which is the minimum power required for the onset of discharge, and the P2 condition is for a plasma with a power of 125 watt, which is the maximum power that we could generate with our current power source. And over here you can see how in the inset plot how the flame with the coronal discharge looks like. So as a first step, we wanted to compare the flame ions with that of the plasma ions, and here we have the ionic size distribution. And when we look at this distribution, especially when we look at the positive ion distribution, we see two trends. One is that the size doesn't change in all three conditions and it stays pretty much consistent. But the other difference that we see is that there is an increase in concentration. So from this we can say that as the size is staying consistent in all three operating conditions, that the ionic species that we have in all three conditions are very similar. Then we look at the size distribution of negative ions, and we see that there is a bimodal peak for flame only condition with peaks at 0.7 nanometers and 1 nanometer. And as we introduce plasmas, we see this peak shift to a single peak at 1 nanometer. Now, the peak at 1 nanometer has been associated with the nitrate ions from previous studies, nitrate ions which are considered to be the major negative charge carriers in a flame. Now, because this peak is enhanced in the presence of plasma, this tells us that the nitrate forming reactions are promoted with the plasma. We then introduce the titania particle precursor TTIP, and then we look at the TiO2 size distribution and the coronal discharge on its coronal discharge's effect on this size distribution. And for lower feed rates which are presented in inset plots, we see that with the introduction of plasmas, the size stays pretty much consistent, but the concentration increases by as much as 150% for a higher powered plasma. Now, this higher concentration will also result in further promotion of particle growth further downstream. And for higher precursor feed rates, we see an opposite trend where the peak size shift towards the left, towards smaller mobility diameters. And for the three feed rates that are considered over here, we see the mobility diameter decrease by 6%, 8%, and 10%. Then we look at the negatively charged clusters again for TiO2 particles, and we see that for lower feed rates, again that the concentration increases, and over here additionally we see that the size also increases by up to 43%. And for higher feed rates, we see that the mobility diameter again shift towards the left to a similar degree of 6%, 8%, and 13% for a plasma with a 125 for a plasma of 125 watt power. And then we look at the influence of coronal discharge on size distribution of silica dioxide particles. Again, for low precursor feed rates, for positive particles and negative particles, we see an increase in concentration, and this increase in concentration is higher for negative particles. And for larger feed rates, for larger precursor feed rates, we see the dP shift towards the left, towards smaller sizes, and this decrease is by 13% for the positively charged clusters and 20% for the negatively charged clusters. So overall, based on a comparison of all these size distributions for a flame only condition and for a flame with plasma condition, we see two trends. We see an increase in concentration for lower precursor feed rates, and we see a suppression of dP at higher precursor feed rates. And for lower precursor feed rates, the increase in concentration we think is largely due to the larger plasma ions coming together, coagulating, and forming stable clusters which act as nucleates, which show up as an increase in concentration. Or it could also be that these high concentration of charge carriers that are present in there enhances the rate of nucleation by the mechanism of ion-induced nucleation. Now that one was for the increase in concentration, but we also want to understand the suppression of dP at higher feed rates, and for that we did some charging. We want to understand the charging characteristics of ions, And for that, we calculated the combination coefficient of the ions and particles. And for this, we used this first equation given right here, which was derived from Fuchs theory. And for this, we mainly needed two parameters: the weighted average of ion mobilities and the mass of these ions. The weighted average, we obtained it from the size distribution, which we scanned using the high resolution DMA earlier. And for mass estimation, we used the following Kilpatrick's relationship. Using this, the plotted combination coefficients are shown here. And over here, we can see basically two trends. One is that the combination coefficient for negative particles, for particles with negative ions, always tends to be higher than the ones with the positive ions, telling us that the particles are preferentially tend to combine with negative ions. And the second feature is that the combination coefficient in terms of in the presence of plasma is much lower than the ones in traditional flame. This is largely due to the larger size of the plasma ions that are present in the system. And because of the larger size, there is less mobility, and because of that, the diffusion charging is likely suppressed. But though the diffusion charging is likely suppressed in the presence of plasma, due to the high electric field that is present there, the field charging effects are greatly enhanced, and it's very likely that these enhanced field charging effects would overcome the suppressed diffusion charging, and this results in more particles being charged negatively, and them and the growth being limited by coagulation mechanisms. So to summarize, we first looked at the ionic species in plasma-assisted combustion and flame ions, and for positive ions, we saw that the ionic species are very similar in mobility, suggesting that these must be similar ionic species. And we saw that the effect on the negative ions was much larger, and that the nitrate forming reactions were promoted in the presence of plasma. Then when we introduced Corona discharge into titanium dioxide and silica dioxide particles, we saw that at low precursor feed rates, the number concentration was increased, which was likely due to plasma ion coagulation, or due to ion-induced nucleation, or a little bit of both. And at higher feed rates, we saw an opposite trend, where we saw suppression of peak particle size, and this was likely due to enhanced field charging effects, though the diffusion charging effects were suppressed due to the larger sizes of the plasma ions. And finally, I would like to acknowledge all my colleagues at Particle Measurement and Technology Lab at University of Miami, and the CAST group, and also NSF for funding this project. Thank you.